My name is Raymond. I have been living and working in Peru on and off since 2019. I think I've been very lucky to have the experience of working and studying alongside not just folks here and learning from them here, but I was able to do my master's research in Nicaragua. And prior to doing my master's research in Nicaragua, I was also able to visit Cuba and visit the agroecological cooperatives there and really understand to what extent the fight for sovereignty is also not just about militant, physical military defense of the state, but it's also about constructing that defense prior to any kind of physical, violent uprising, what have you. You have to be able to defend sovereignty leading up to, during, and prior to, and after the revolution. And what that means, especially for folks that are militantly against United States intervention and for folks that are trying to fight for their own sovereignty, what that means is sustainable agriculture. And that doesn't mean it in the sense that, we're going to do a bunch of agroforestry and everything is going to be fine, where we basically inject greenwashing and these whitewashed agroecological principles onto an existing capitalist framework, because you cannot build anti-capitalist structures with capitalism. You must build them using historic ways of life and ways of living and ways of being and ways of knowing. And so what agroecology is the rescue of traditional campesino, indigenous ways of producing and living and interacting with one another, and reestablishing the relationship between people and the land. And that's important for a number of reasons. Number one being that if you are a people that are besieged by U.S. sanctions, that means that your trade is extremely limited. So if your trade is limited, you must become increasingly self-sufficient. And that way, the most vulnerable among you are the least impacted by U.S. economic sanctions, because the point of U.S. sanctions is to overthrow democratically elected governments and for those sanctions to hurt the most vulnerable. The goal of agroecology is to be a bulwark for those people so that they do not suffer nearly as much as the United States wants them to. And in Nicaragua, what this has done most tangibly and most recently is has allowed Nicaragua to survive and overthrow the 2018 coup attempt that was led and financed by the United States. Because the campesino class had an extensive cooperative structure that was revived by the Sandinistas when Daniel Ortega was reelected, what that has done is it has allowed people to fight for regional food sovereignty and for these cooperative systems to essentially allow people to exist, especially in the Pacific coast, in these decentralized, almost anarchistic spaces where they get lots of support top-down from the national government. And from this top-down national support, they are able to live in this decentralized way in which they are dependent on themselves and what they produce, and that is facilitated through the national support. And so what we saw in the 2018 coup attempt was that during the months of the coup, the campesinos did not have to leave their cooperatives and risk their lives to access food, to access medicine. They were already growing everything that they needed, and so they were protected. And so even though the coup attempt was incredibly violent, lives were saved and the community rallied because they saw that this model was working. And that's incredibly important. In Peru, we are not at that same stage yet, but we are seeing that the issues that gave rise to the need for the cooperative movement in Nicaragua, in Cuba, are also present here, where we have many rural folks, whether it's in the Amazon or the Andes, that are dealing with high rates of food insecurity. They're dealing with forced assimilation into the capitalist economy. We have very high urban flight. We have, especially in the valleys, a forced imposition of heavy machinery, pesticides, herbicides, you name it. If it's industrially produced, people are almost forced to use it because we exist in a globalized food chain in order to do trade with the United States with Europe, there's actually a requirement that you use these fertilizers and you use these pesticides. If you want to compete, you have to pay in to this system. And all of this erodes local sovereignty. And what that means is that eventually, through the use of heavy machinery, through the use of an overuse of pesticides and herbicides, insecticides, what have you, it means that your quality of land deteriorates over time. Your campesino class becomes indebted, and they have to purchase the seeds that they need in order to sow their own crops. They're not allowed to reuse or harvest seeds in order to sow for the next year, and they become increasingly dependent. And so people are expelled off their land through the created dependency, through an artificial dependency which did not exist prior. People are also forced off their land when you have these international mining companies, especially ones that are owned by the United States. We have a lot of mining in Peru, especially in the Andes, that are owned by the United States and Canada, in addition to Chilean and Brazilian companies as well. And what they like to do is they will buy up a small bit of land at a time. They completely poison and contaminate the water supply. People's crops fail, their animals die, they're forced off the land in that capacity, but they can't leave because they are campesinos. And they get forced essentially into these shanty towns where they serve the miners who come from areas where they receive more high-skilled training, typically Lima. And so you have these mobile populations of typically young men who populate then these towns. They become violent and exploitative of local women, and they create a very dangerous situation, and the inequality between the indigenous folks and outsiders, whether they are national outsiders or international, only expands over time. And so you have flight for that reason as well. And then of course you also have young people who are leaving places like the Amazon, like the Andes, because they don't have access to very basic things like education, quality medical care. They aren't able to feel like they are having a life that is meaningful to them because the basic services that they have a constitutional right to have simply are not present. And what that means is because if you live in an area where you have very little access to education, it means you're not going to be able to access or get a job that is going to allow you to live in dignity. And if you can't get a dignified job, if you can't get a dignified wage, if you are constantly in the informal economy, which most Peruvians are, with a very high rate of informality, it's over 2/3 of all Peruvians work informally, that means you are not making minimum wage. You are not protected by unions. You are not getting any single kind of benefit whatsoever. It undermines the collective bargaining power of the entire working class. And that directly serves U.S. imperial interests, because as long as you have an informal mobile class of people who are living hand to mouth, it makes it much harder for people to come together and fight for their collective rights, because everybody is working in such an individualistic capacity. And so young people typically tend to leave the rural regions to go look for work in especially Lima and send money back to their communities at home, because they have a very strong sense of needing to take care of their parents and grandparents who raised them. And so they have a very strong connection to place, but in order to maintain that connection, they themselves have to leave. And we also see this in diaspora communities, where people in Peru, especially who live in the rural areas, are becoming increasingly dependent on remittances. There's a very large chunk and a very significant chunk of Peruvian revenue that just comes from remittances, because folks locally cannot survive. After the successful coup against Pedro Castillo, the inequality and the poverty rate has grown tremendously under Dina Boluarte. And the people who have suffered the most, especially in the Lima area, are the Quechua folks, who live behind the Muros de Vergüenza, some of which are still standing, and make up at least half, if not more, of the population, who are completely marginalized, and people that are living in the inner city, who are either homeless or they beg or have to take very menial, temporary hand-to-mouth jobs and have very few economic options. All of this is exaggerated by colonialism and indigeneity. So when my friends and the people that I know and that I work with in the Irapa and in the Amazon decide to go work in Iquitos or in Lima, They typically end up working in industrial factories. They work in industrial chicken farming. If they're in Iquitos often, they work in the petroleum industry. I've worked with people who used to work for cartels in order to raise the money they needed to pay for surgeries for their parents or pay for expensive medical care, because they can't access medical care because they're not integrated into the formal economy. And so they have to put their life on the line in order to get this very basic access that they're not afforded to because they are indigenous and they won't give up their way of life. And when folks come into these big urban centers, they are so discriminated against that they don't have options. They just will not be hired. There was a massive scandal about 3 years ago when a couple of Amazonian young men tried to go into a movie theater and they were not allowed in. And it might have made national news for maybe a week. And it made such a small ripple because that is the treatment that people are already accustomed to receiving. There is very little solidarity between folks nationally and folks in the Amazon. When we see national protests, it's typically not the younger folks that are participating in those protests. If you look at the demographics of the people that are participating in the struggles against the privatization of water, against the ley antiforestal, against the assassinations of land defenders, especially in the Amazon, it tends to be folks from the older generation that are participating in these fights because the young people have left and they have been forced to leave in order to get jobs here and send money back because they're being forcibly integrated into the capitalist superstructure. And that is completely by design. One of the scarier parts of the ley antiforestal is that once land burns, particularly in the Amazon, when it's a victim of a wildfire, it is now subject to be sold and to be bought by petroleum companies to undermine explicitly indigenous sovereignty and kick people off of their lands. So the people who have decided that they are going to stay and they're going to fight now don't even have that option because it's no longer considered virgin land after wildfire. And we have a responsibility as people that are either from the United States or people that live in the United States to talk very explicitly about this and understand and communicate that it is our responsibility in the United States to be the advocates for and uplift people that are here. Because the reason that these wildfires in Peru are going out of control, especially during the dry season, is because those emissions Peruvians are not responsible for those emissions. Those emissions are the result of the way that we live our lives in the United States and in Europe. They come from our capitalists, our billionaires, our ruling class. And so it is absolutely our duty to oppose them every single way that we can until we win. If Peru stopped emitting all carbon emissions tomorrow, it would not make a difference. It would not stop the Andes melting. It would not stop the wildfires. Those wildfires will only stop, and the melting of the Andes won't stop, and the drying up of the Amazon will not stop until we ourselves in the imperial core get our shit together and we actually form a militant, united movement against capitalism, against imperialism. And our voices, unfortunately, because of where we fall in the labor aristocracy, matter more. They are taken more seriously. They are the ones that get transmitted and shared and listened to and watched. Unfortunately, it is people in the United States and Europe that make the policies that trap and underdevelop the tricontinental. And underdevelopment is something not that is a result or something that just exists by itself. It's something that is done to somebody, in which an economy is subverted to serve a colonial master or occupier. And so the Peruvian economy has been subverted in order to serve the needs of the United States and the needs of Europeans. It does not serve the Peruvian people. And we see this not just in Peru, but we see this across Latin America, we see this across Africa, and we see it in parts of Asia as well. And as a result, because we are the ones that are living and benefiting off of the suffering of people here, it is our duty to oppose that. Because of our liberation and our comfort And our ability to navigate, quote unquote, freely comes from the violent exploitation of other people. If that freedom and comfort comes from the limiting of their options and their immiseration, that is not freedom, that is not liberty, that is not justice, and we cannot have a militant anti-capitalist movement that does not acknowledge that does not show any interest in what people are experiencing in other parts of the world. I've been living and working in Peru on and off since 2019. When I first started working here, I began working as a herpetologist in 2019 as a part of a research program that I was doing for my undergraduate degree. And based on research that I did at the time, I was offered to come back and work as a full-time herpetologist on the Quebrada, which is alongside essentially the Rio Amazonas in the department of Loreto. And that is in the western portion of the Amazonian River Basin, where the Amazonas is born, from the Ucayali and the Rio Marañón. However, because of the pandemic, I was unable to immediately take the job. I worked as a barista full-time. I worked 2 different jobs for a year before the borders opened up, and I was able to come back. And I came back with the intention to stay. And I didn't think that I would have to go back to the United States. I didn't have a ticket back. I was going to keep working and figuring it out. Except I found out very quickly that field stations here will not hire foreign biologists if we don't have a master's degree or a PhD. And because I was essentially an illegal immigrant, I could not apply to a Peruvian university in order to continue my higher education here. And so I was lucky enough to be able to go back to the United States and get my master's degree in sustainable development practice from the University of Florida. And while I was in my last semester at the University of Florida, I took a job with the Peace Corps in Parque Nacional Huascarán, working for CERNAM, which is El Servicio Nacional de las Áreas Naturales Protegidas, which is very much like the National Park Service of Peru, essentially. And I was in charge of designing essentially a sustainable management plan for the trash in the park. There is not a single national protected area in all of Peru that has a trash management plan. There are very few regions or departments in Peru that have such plans even for their cities. And so, as much as I had issues with the Peace Corps, it was still important work that needed to be done. And I have just finished up my contract with the Peace Corps, and I'm going back to work in the Amazonas in a couple of weeks, which I'm super excited about. But it's difficult at this point to go back to work as just a herpetologist, because I'm not the same person that I was now as when I first started doing this work. I radicalized a lot while I was working here from 2022 to 2023. Where I currently work in the Quebrada is very close to the community Tamishaku-Tawayu. And Tamishaku-Tawayu is one of, if not the first, indigenous community in all of Peru that was able to begin operating under its own community management and control, under the community conservation model. And so what our field station does is its biologists go and they do research on the plants and the mammals that are the most important to the community, to the fish, to the dolphins, whatever is important for local folks, and they determine if those species are being used sustainably. And so the communities are then able to use that research in order to defend their titulación, so that they can have permanence and that they can stay. It's very important that communities in the Amazon have sovereignty and they are able to manage their own territories. Because when they're able to manage their own territories, as much as I love frogs and I love studying frogs, the frogs are going to be there and the frogs are going to be fine as long as the communities are there and the communities are fine and the communities have sovereignty. That is the most important thing at the end of the day. when we talk, especially in the Peruvian context, about indigenous people and about people who live in the selva, there's a very big focus, and I would describe it honestly as a fetishization of people who are uncontacted, which is a mistake for a number of reasons, one of the biggest of which being that they're not uncontacted. Uncontacted people are people who actually did have contact with Europeans, with settlers, especially during the rubber boom when the Europeans came into Peru. They came mostly into the Amazonian regions, and they violently mistreated and enslaved people, essentially, in order to extract gaucho, or rubber, because gaucho can only grow in wild Amazon. And so, as a result, people were tortured, they were murdered, they were mutilated, they experienced very similar conditions to what the Belgians inflicted on the Congolese. And that is a history that Peru does not talk very much about, and we don't talk about it very much about it internationally. And what happened with these communities is that they decided that they were going to retreat as deep into the Amazon as they could, to where Westerners could physically not get to them. And so they went to some of the most hard to defend, or I should say, easiest to defend, hardest to reach places of the Amazon, because they knew that only they were going to be capable of surviving out there, that they could not physically be followed. And so many uncontacted communities do not live where they historically lived prior to colonization. And so it is a mistake to say that they are uncontacted. They are in voluntary isolation. And they are in voluntary isolation because they would rather die and die on their own terms than be forced to assimilate. The communities that I currently work with in the Irapa, in Loreto, are in a process, and a slow process, of assimilation. And we do what we can in order to slow that process, in order to help people make decisions on their own terms, in their own time. But there is an extreme amount of pressure from regional and the national government in order to assimilate people into the cash economy. So we have a very high rate of urban flight, with young people leaving the Amazon and taking work in Iquitos, taking work in Lima. And because there is a very strong racial caste system in Peru, indigenous Amazonians are very much at the bottom of that heap. And they get some of the worst, most dangerous, most poorly paying jobs in the country, where they're very often not even paid the legal minimum wage. They are viciously exploited because their lives are not seen as valuable. And I have borne witness to some of this. Not only have I worked in the Amazon, but I've also worked in the Andes, in Ancash. And people want to stay. Not only does the older generation want to stay in their communities, but the younger generation wants to stay as well. People do not want to leave, but they don't feel like they have a choice financially, because they don't have access to the kinds of goods and services and basic medical services, for example, access to clean water, access to good education, access to an education that's going to allow them to get a decent, dignified job that's not going to leave them violently exploited. And so they feel like they are forced to leave their communities, and they are forced to integrate into this neoliberal capitalist system that they do not want to assimilate into. But if the young people don't bite the bullet, they're forced to watch their parents and their grandparents live in abject poverty, while they themselves feel a lot of responsibility for taking care of the folks that raised them. And so they are in what we describe as a callejón sin salida. There is very little for folks to do when they don't feel like they have options. And it's a situation that the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians have put Peruvians in. It is not a situation that Peruvians have chosen for themselves. And so when I made the decision to immigrate here, I made the decision because I realized that if I wanted to continue to work in ecology and I wanted to continue doing development work, I did not want to have an extractive and exploitative relationship with my colleagues, with my friends, with the communities I was working alongside. I wanted to work with people and not be in an office somewhere far away in Washington, D.C. with like making an American salary with fucking AC whenever I want, what have you. it's important to live and work alongside those same communities that you're serving, so you understand their conditions, you understand their needs, you're accessible, you're someone that they can talk to, and so you also have stake in the game. Their struggle is my struggle, and I can't embody that in a way for people to believe if I'm constantly leaving, and if I have the ability to leave, if I always leave the back door open. And so I made the decision to get my master's degree in development so that I could better serve the folks that I had come to love in the Amazon. When I took the job with the Peace Corps, I took it thinking that it would allow me that door to permanence. I thought that it would help me get the visa that I needed, that I was unable to get the first time that I tried to immigrate here in 2022. But it turns out that the Peace Corps is an extremely exploitative organization. It's designed to be that way. And volunteers lose all of their legal status the second that they finish with their contracts, because the United States does not have any desire for volunteers to stay. They encourage volunteers to integrate in the most superficial ways possible. So they go back to the United States and they take jobs in development with the State Department, and they continue to work on development projects that seek to undermine local sovereignty. The point of the Peace Corps is for volunteers from the United States to build relationships with communities so they are more trustful of United States intervention. So they themselves will open the door to advisors from the United States, to more trained development technicians than the volunteers themselves. The volunteers themselves are not doing this work, but they are making that work possible. They are opening the door to further neoliberal development. And that is something not only that needs to stop, and the Peace Corps just needs to be dissolved, but it's something that the volunteers themselves are not made aware of. And not all of the volunteers work in the capacity where that's something that they even want themselves. They don't want to be participating in the structure necessarily, but they want to get out of the United States. I wanted to get out of the United States as a queer person because I have no access to medical care in the United States. I do have access to care here. I do have access to dignity here. We don't have the same amount of surface level protections for queer people in Peru as we do in the United States, but we also are not constantly under attack in the same capacity, where our right to just exist in public space is not being debated at the national stage. And that's a very key difference. We have people, especially in Lima, but also in the provinces, that are fighting for all kinds of folks every single day in ways that we are unable to do with the same kind of strength in the United States, because in the United States our organizations are often very fragmented. In Peru there is a stronger nucleus, I would say, where especially rural folks tend to come down on being very progressive because they are interested in land rights, they're interested in water rights, they're interested in sovereignty, they're interested in things like agroecology or agricultura campesina or agricultura familiar, which is just familial family agriculture and preserving and protecting their ways of life. They fall down on the left by casualidad, because the aims of leftists and the aims of socialists and the aims of communists are also organically their own interests themselves, versus we have a very different understanding of what the goals of our own communities are in the United States.